Welcome to Cheat Sheet Tale, where secrets slip, lies unravel, and the truth always has a twist. Real stories, raw confessions, and shocking betrayals. Drop a comment if you've ever caught a red flag too late. Now let's get into today's tale. Welcome to Cheat Sheet Tale, where secrets slip, lies unravel, and the truth always has a twist. Real stories, raw confessions, and shocking betrayals. Drop a comment if you've ever caught a red flag too late. Now let's get into today's tale. You're not working at that firm. My dad said, "You're not smart enough to last a week." So I took the job anyway. And a month later, my boss called me a genius in disguise in front of the whole team. My dad told me I wasn't smart enough to last a week. At a top consulting firm I got an offer from, he literally said, "You're not working at that firm. You're not smart enough to last a week." I took the job anyway. A month later, my boss called me a genius in disguise in front of the entire company. I don't even want to gloat. I just want to understand why my own father can't seem to believe in me no matter what I do. I was sitting at the kitchen counter in my father's house in Fort Collins, Colorado, slowly stirring cream into a chipped mug of coffee when he said it. "You're not working at that firm," he muttered without looking up from his newspaper. "You're not smart enough to last a week." He didn't say it with cruelty. He said it like he was diagnosing a leaky pipe or making a casual observation about the weather. Just a fact in his mind that stung more than yelling ever could. I didn't respond. I just nodded, pressed my lips together, and sipped the bitter coffee. I was 32 years old temporarily back at home after finishing grad school while looking for full-time work in Denver. I hadn't expected to be back. Certainly not long enough to start falling into old family dynamics again. But life doesn't care about expectations. To be fair, my father wasn't a monster, he wasn't abusive, he paid the bills, showed up to work every day until retirement, and kept the lawn impossibly neat. But he had a very narrow view of success, one shaped by growing up during a time when blueprints and calculations were the only way to make a name for yourself. He was a mechanical engineer for 3 decades, and that title had become his personality. I was never like him. While my older brother raced through AP calculus and robotic competitions, I lingered in libraries and fell in love with nuanced literature, history, psychology, human messiness. I wasn't trying to rebel. I just saw beauty in places he didn't. When I told him I was applying for a job at Larchmont Strategy Group in Denver, a boutique consulting firm known for bold, unconventional approaches, he barely raised an eyebrow. When I said I got the job, that's when he delivered his verdict. And again, I didn't argue, because when you've grown up with a parent who constantly doubts your ability in subtle, polite ways, you learn that defending yourself usually ends in exhaustion, not resolution. I packed my things a week later and moved into a tiny Denver studio apartment, promising myself I wouldn't look back. The first few days at Larchmont were rough. The office was sleek, cold, expensive looking, an intimidating sea of smart people with names you see on startup panels or Forbes under 40 lists. They spoke fast, moved fast, and made me feel like I was always 3 steps behind. I had been hired into the research and strategy team, a group tasked with solving complex client problems, sometimes with as little as 24 hours notice. We weren't just creating PowerPoints. We were shaping narratives, guiding million-dollar decisions, and standing toe-to-toe with C-white executives. On paper, I didn't belong. My degree was from a state school. My resume was patchy. Some freelance research gigs, a grad degree in communications, and a 2-year stint at a nonprofit. I was definitely the outlier. But something clicked during those late nights. Most of my team were great with numbers, but not with stories. They could analyze markets, but they struggled to explain why a company's growth had stalled or why a product wasn't connecting with its audience. That's where I found my groove. I began rewriting project briefs not just with data, but with meaning, threading together disparate facts and trends into a cohesive, human-centered strategy. I stopped trying to compete with the sharpest brains in the room and just focused on what I knew best: patterns, language, psychology. 2 weeks in, I revised a client proposal for a real estate conglomerate that was teetering on the edge of terminating our contract. The original draft was all numbers, no insight. I spent the weekend on it, redesigning it around consumer behavior, market psychology, and storytelling. I didn't even tell my manager, I just uploaded my version to the internal server and left a note. Monday came, no one said anything. Tuesday, same, I figured they scrapped it. Then Thursday hit. We were called into an all-hands meeting. I thought it was about Q3 projections or some HR update. Our CO Miles, who everyone treated like royalty, walked to the front of the room and cleared his throat. "I want to highlight something exceptional," he said, holding up a sheath of papers. "This proposal saved a $12 million account." Then he said my name, Isla Delane. "I don't know who gave you permission to rewrite it, but you clearly saw something the rest of us didn't. That's not just bold, it's brilliant. That's what this firm needs more of. A genius in disguise." There was silence, then a ripple of claps. Some confused, some curious, some warm. I just sat there, stunned, heat crawling up my neck. It wasn't the praise that hit me. It was the disbelief that I had finally been seen, that someone important looked at my work and said, "This matters." The rest of the month passed in a blur. I was given more responsibility. Junior analysts started looping me into their brainstorms. Even my manager, Nora, this terrifyingly sharp woman with a reputation for being impossible to impress, invited me to co-present at our next client meeting. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was pretending. So naturally, I called my dad because some part of me still wanted to share the moment, to hear a sliver of pride in his voice. I told him everything. How the CEO had singled me out, how the team responded, how it felt. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Well, maybe they were just trying to encourage you. Keep your expectations realistic." "Marian, it's just one proposal. It wasn't even..." Anger I felt was emptiness. Like standing in front of a well you keep going back to only to find it dry every single time. I didn't argue. I never argue anymore. I thanked him for picking up, said I had to go, and hung up. Back in Denver, I started building a life. My studio felt less like a stopgap and more like home. I rearranged furniture, bought a used espresso machine, found a little Greek diner nearby, where the owner, Kian, called me kiddo and made me try every new recipe he tested. Work stayed. Intense, but I thrived in it. I began mentoring one of the new hires, a guy named Jude, who reminded me of myself. Quiet, uncertain, trying to figure out where he fit. One day after a client meeting where he'd completely frozen during the Q&A, I pulled him aside. "You don't need to be the loudest voice," I said. "You just need to listen better than anyone else. That's your edge." He looked at me like I just unlocked something. And that's when I realized my father had been wrong. Not just about me being smart enough, but about what smart even means, about what worth means. Still, part of me wonders, what would it take for him to actually say it? It was around that time I started getting invitations to internal strategy sessions I had no business being in, at least by title. Nora would casually forward me calendar invites without saying much, just a simple thought. "This might interest you." I'd show up quiet, scribbling notes while directors pitched ideas and project leads debated client goals. First, I thought I was there to observe, but then Nora would pause mid-meeting and glance over Marian. "What's your read?" I'd offer something careful at first, but always grounded. Why a client's rebrand felt out of sync with their target audience, why their messaging read like it was written by someone afraid to sound human. And somehow every time it added a layer, no one had considered I wasn't being disruptive. I was just noticing the emotional logic beneath the data, the friction people couldn't articulate but clearly felt. It was intuitive for me, almost second nature, but new to them. The senior staff started calling it Isla's gut. I smiled at the phrase but never corrected them. It wasn't gut. It was years of listening, observing, and reading between every line my own life had ever thrown at me. You learn to find patterns when you've spent 3 decades trying to be understood by someone who doesn't really see you. One afternoon, as I was walking out of a pitch meeting, Nora pulled me aside. "Come with me." I followed her to the elevator up 2 floors to a wing I hadn't even been to before. She led me into a small glass-walled conference room and closed the door behind us. "You've got a brain I've only seen a handful of times in my career," she said, arms crossed, eyes fixed on mine. "But more than that, you've got clarity. That's rare." I wasn't sure what to say. I think I nodded, maybe muttered something like, "Thank you." Then she leaned against the table. "I want to fast-track you for a leadership role, strategy lead. Not in 2 years, No, it's not a formality, you've earned it, but you need to want it. I blinked. My heart did that funny twist, excitement mixed with the old voice in the back of my mind asking if this was a mistake, if maybe I'd fooled everyone and they'd find out soon. But I nodded. I want it. Nora gave one of her rare smiles, brief but real. Then let's get to work. That night, I sat in my apartment and stared at my reflection in the living room window. Denver's lights behind me. I couldn't remember the last time I felt proud and scared at the same time. Out of habit, or maybe something deeper, I called my brother Leo. We hadn't been especially to do everything differently, but things had softened between us since Mom left. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, stranger. Got a minute for you always. I told him everything. The meetings, the promotion offer. Nora's comments, I held my breath, bracing for skepticism, but instead he chuckled. Jesus, Marion, that's huge, like big league huge. Yeah, you finally found your sandbox. Took you long enough? I laughed for real. Then it felt good. Has Dad heard? He asked after a beat. I hesitated. No, not officially. He wouldn't understand. Leo was quiet for a moment. You sure about that? Yeah. He thinks I'm playing consultant dress up. I told him about the praise I got from Miles last month. You know what he said? I can guess. Maybe they were just trying to encourage you, like I'm a charity case. Leo sighed. Look, you don't need his permission to be brilliant, Marion. But I get it. It would be nice to hear it from him. I stared out at the skyline, wondering if that day would ever come. Yeah, it would. A few weeks later, my father called me. That was unusual in itself. He only really called to remind me of birthdays or family gatherings. But this time he sounded measured. I saw something online. He began a company article. They mentioned you by name. Nora had posted an internal feature about our team strategy win, and Larchmont's marketing team had shared it publicly. My name had been in the second paragraph. You're doing all right? He added. Thanks, I replied cautiously. There was a pause. I could practically hear him struggling to figure out what to say next. Then finally, I just didn't expect this. Not that you couldn't work hard. I just didn't think this was your world. It wasn't, I said quietly, until I made it mine. He didn't respond to that, just cleared his throat and asked if I'd be visiting for Thanksgiving. I told him I'd think about it because the truth was, I wasn't sure Thanksgiving loomed like a cloud. I hadn't been back home since before I started the job. My brother was going. My dad had extended the invite, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to return to the place where my voice had always felt so small. I talked to Nora about it one evening after work. She wasn't just my boss anymore. We'd become something closer to friends. In a careful, professional kind of way. You afraid of what he'll say? She asked. No, I replied honestly. I'm afraid of what he won't say. Nora nodded slowly. Then say what you need to for you. I wasn't sure what I needed to say, but I booked a train ticket anyway. The train ride back to Fort Collins felt longer than it was. Something about the rhythm of the tracks and the early winter light made everything feel heavier. I hadn't been back since I moved to Denver, and even though it had only been a year and a half, it felt like a lifetime had passed. I arrived the afternoon before Thanksgiving. Leo picked me up from the station, and we drove the familiar route home past the same gas stations, the same windswept fields, the same faded billboards offering corn mazes and hay rides. It was all exactly the same, except me. Dad met us at the door. He opened it, slowly, nodded once, then stepped aside so I could come in. The house smelled like lemon polish and reheated soup just like always. He had his flannel tucked in too tightly, like he dressed for a photo he didn't really want to be in. You made good time. He said, yeah, train. Was half empty. He nodded, rooms ready. That was it. No hug. No how's the job. Nope. Glad you're here. But then again, I didn't expect any of that. I set my bag down in my old room, smaller than I remembered, shelves still lined with the old paperbacks I hadn't touched since high school. There was a new bedspread, though, crisp and stiff. Probably something he'd bought just for the occasion. We settled into the usual pattern. Leo and I made most of the dinner, and Dad busied himself with unnecessary tasks, checking the water heater, moving things from one garage shelf to another. It wasn't until we all sat down at the table the next day that the weight of it started to settle in. The meal was fine. No works, no fights. Leo kept the conversation, going asking about work traffic, Denver housing prices. Dad mostly responded with one-word answers or unprovoked weather commentary. I waited, but he never brought up the article, not the praise, not the phone call. After dinner, I went outside to get air. It had just started to snow, light dry flakes that dissolved the second they hit the pavement. I stood in the driveway, arms crossed, wondering if this whole visit had been a mistake. Then I heard the door creak behind me. "Cold out here?" Dad said, "Yeah." He stood beside me, not too close, hands shoved in his coat pockets. We both looked out at the street, quiet and unlit. "I saw that article again," he said finally. "Read it through this time." I said, "Nothing." He shifted slightly. "People at that company think you're something special." "I work hard," I said. "You do?" He agreed. Like it surprised him. Another pause. The wind picked up. "You remember when you were 10, he said slowly, "and you entered that story contest through the library." I looked at him, caught off guard. "Yeah, I got second place." "You wrote about that woman on the bench, how she sat there every day feeding the birds, but was actually waiting for someone who never showed up." My throat tightened a little. "You read it?" He nodded. "Didn't understand it. But your mom cried when she did." I looked down at the snow-covered driveway. "You've always seen things different," he said. "I guess I thought the world wouldn't reward that. I didn't want you to be disappointed. I wasn't sure how to answer, that it felt like the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get." "It wasn't your job to decide what the world would reward," I said quietly. "It was mine to figure out where I belonged." He nodded once, eyes still forward. "You did that," he said. We went inside. Not long after. Nothing else was said that night. No emotional breakthroughs, no sudden transformation, just quiet understanding settling into the space between us. The rest of the weekend was unremarkable. Leo headed back first. I left the morning, after Dad gave me a firm handshake before I stepped out the door. "Be good," he said. "You too." I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I wanted a big moment, something cathartic and complete, but real life doesn't always hand you tidy endings. Sometimes, it just gives you fragments, a change in tone, a moment of recognition, and for now that was enough. Back in Denver, life picked up again. I threw myself into work. My strategy lead role was officially announced company-wide. I started managing a small team. Jude was one of them. Watching him grow into the role reminded me of myself when I first started. So unsure, so ready to run in the wrong direction just to feel like he was moving. One afternoon, I sat with him in a debrief meeting he just presented to a difficult client who had interrupted him 3 times mid-sentence. He looked deflated. "You did well," I said. He shook his head. "I don't think they took me seriously." "They didn't, but you still held your ground." He looked at me like that hadn't occurred to him. "Being smart won't always be enough," I added. "But being grounded, that keeps you in the room." He nodded slowly. "Thanks." Later that evening, Nora emailed me a note. It was short. Just, "You've got the team humming. Keep going." I sat back, reread it twice, and thought about how far I'd come. A year ago, I was invisible. Now I was shaping outcomes, not just projects, but people. And yet I still found myself checking my phone once in a while, wondering if my father would ever call just to say, "I'm proud of you." He hadn't, not yet. But maybe someday. For now, I was building a life where I didn't need it to breathe, but if it came, I'd still listen. Months passed, I settled into my new role, balancing client strategy with team management. I learned to trust my instincts more. I spoke up in executive meetings. I even started writing internal white papers on client psychology and communication frameworks, half research, half storytelling. Nora began forwarding them to Miles, the CEO, and soon they made their way across departments. I was no longer the one with potential. I was the one with a vision. What I didn't know then was that Larchmont had been quietly positioning itself for acquisition. A much larger consulting giant, Delamere Group, had been circling us for months, looking to bring our unique strategy models into their portfolio. The leadership team had kept it close to the chest, but things were moving fast. One afternoon in early spring, Nora pulled me into her office. "We're being acquired," she said without preamble. I raised my eyebrows. "They're going to restructure the senior leadership," she continued. "A few of us will be stepping aside. They want a new face running the Denver division." I waited. "They want it to be you." I stared at her, unsure if I heard right. "Me, you've changed how we work. Your methods, your thinking, you've got the team's respect." The execs upstairs noticed, and frankly, I think they're right. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to fall into old habits. Minimize, defer? Look for reasons I wasn't qualified, but I didn't? I just nodded. "Hey, let's do it." 2 weeks later, the official announcement went out. I was named Director of Strategic Operations for the newly merged Denver office, the youngest division, head in Delamere Group's Western operations. The emails poured in, old coworkers, clients, even distant connections from grad school. And then my father, he didn't call this time. He emailed a single sentence. "Congratulations. You've built something real." It wasn't warm, it wasn't poetic, but it was more than I'd ever gotten, and yet I didn't respond. Not out of spite, out of choice. For once, I didn't feel the need to reach backward for validation. I had people in my present who saw me clearly. But fate, as always, had one more card to play. A month after the merger, I was invited to speak at a business panel in Fort Collins, my hometown. It was hosted by the local university's business department and sponsored by a regional economic group. They wanted to highlight local figures who had become leaders in innovation. Nora nominated me. I almost declined, but then I saw who else was on the panel. An old colleague of my father's, Paul Renier, was one of the organizers. He'd been close to my dad during his engineering years, had even mentored him once. According to Leo, Paul still talked to my father occasionally. I accepted. The day of the panel was surreal. I wore a navy blazer, jeans, and my favorite leather boots. No power heels, no dramatic makeup. I wanted to be myself. I sat on a stage in a lecture hall with 3 other speakers. One was a tech startup founder, another a logistics executive, and there I was, the woman who told stories for a living and got paid to translate complexity into action. The audience was a mix of students, faculty, and local professionals. I spotted Paul in the front row, and next to him, my father. He hadn't told me he was coming. I kept my face neutral, but my chest felt like it was vibrating. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare a script. I never did. I walked to the podium and said, I wasn't the smartest person in any room I walked into when I started, but I learned how to pay attention. And I learned that people don't buy ideas. They buy trust. They buy stories that help them understand themselves. I paused. My work isn't about winning arguments or being right. It's about giving clients language. They didn't know they needed to solve problems they couldn't name. That's what strategy really is. Empathy that earns outcomes. Applause followed. Not roaring, but solid. When the panel ended, people trickled forward to shake hands, ask questions. I saw Paul lean over and say something to my dad. He looked stunned. For the first time in my life. My father looked like he didn't have something ready to say. When I finally walked toward him, he stood up, then hesitated. He started, then stopped. I know, I said gently. I think I misjudged what you were capable of, he said after a pause. I smiled. You did, I replied. But I didn't. I walked past him, not with malice, but with grace. It wasn't a scene. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet, complete, and unmistakably mine back in Denver. I got back to work. I led my team through 2 high-stakes transitions. I got invited to speak at conferences. I mentored new hires. I built a strategy framework that would eventually become a signature part of the new firm's onboarding process. I never did send that email back to my dad, but I knew he saw me differently now. And while part of me had longed for that moment, some final validation, I realized the most powerful thing wasn't winning his approval. It was knowing I never really needed